Moves to Innocence 1. Settler Nativism. In this move to innocence, settlers locate or invent a long-lost ancestor who is rumored to have had, quote, Indian blood, end quote, and they use this claim to mark themselves as blameless in the attempted eradications of indigenous peoples. There are numerous examples of public figures in the United States who remember a distant Native ancestor, including Nancy Reagan, who is said to be a descendant of Pocahontas, and, more recently, Elizabeth Warren and many others, illustrating how commonplace settler nativism is. Vine Deloria Jr. discusses what he calls the Indian grandmother complex in the following account from Custer Died for Your Sins. During my 3 years as executive director of the National Congress of American Indians, it was a rare day when some white person didn't visit my office and proudly proclaim that he or she was of Indian descent. At times, I became quite defensive about being a Sioux when these white people had a pedigree that was so much more respectable than mine. But eventually, I came to understand their need to identify as partially Indian and did not resent them. I would confirm their wildest stories about their Indian ancestry and would add a few tales of my own, hoping that they would be able to accept themselves someday and leave us alone. Whites claiming Indian blood generally tend to reinforce mythical beliefs about Indians. All but one person I met who claimed Indian blood claimed it on their grandmother's side. I once did a projection backward and discovered that evidently most tribes were entirely female for the first 300 years of white occupation. No one, it seemed, wanted to claim a male Indian as a forebear. It doesn't take much insight into racial attitudes to understand the real meaning of the Indian grandmother complex that plagues certain white people. A male ancestor has too much of the aura of the savage warrior, the unknown primitive, the instinctive animal to make him a respectable member of the family tree. But a young Indian princess? There was royalty for the taking. Somehow, the white was linked with a noble house of gentility and culture if his grandmother was an Indian princess who ran away with an intrepid pioneer. While a real Indian grandmother is probably the nicest thing that could happen to a child, why is a remote Indian princess grandmother so necessary for many white people? Is it because they are afraid of being classed as foreigners? Do they need some blood tie with the frontier and its dangers in order to experience what it means to be an American? Or is it an attempt to avoid facing the guilt they bear for the treatment of Indians? End quote. Settler nativism, or what Vine Deloria Jr. calls the Indian grandmother complex, is a settler move to innocence because it is an attempt to deflect a settler identity while continuing to enjoy settler privilege and occupying stolen land. Deloria observes that settler nativism is gendered and considers the reasons a storied Indian grandmother might have more appeal than an Indian grandfather. On one level, it can be expected that many settlers have an ancestor who was indigenous and/or who was a chattel slave. This is precisely the habit of settler colonialism, which pushes humans into other human communities. Strategies of rape and sexual violence, and also the ordinary attractions of human relationships, ensure that settlers have indigenous and chattel slave ancestors. Further, though race is a social construct, indigenous peoples and chattel slaves, particularly slaves from the continent of Africa, were/are racialized differently in ways that supported the logics and aims of settler colonialism, the erasure of the indigenous person, and the capture and containment of the slave. Quote, Indians and black people in the U.S. have been racialized in opposing ways that reflect their antithetical roles in the formation of U.S. society. Patrick Wolf explains, quote, black people's enslavement produced an inclusive taxonomy that automatically enslaved the offspring of a slave and any other parent. In the wake of slavery, this taxonomy became fully racialized in the, quote, one-drop rule, end quote, whereby any amount of African ancestry, no matter how remote and regardless of phenotypical appearance, makes a black person or a person black, end quote. Kim Tallbear argues that the one-drop rule dominates understandings of race in the United States, and so most people in the U.S. have not been able to understand indigenous identity. Through the one-drop rule, blackness in settler colonial contexts is expansive, ensuring that a slave/criminal status will be inherited by an expanding number of black descendants. Yet, indigenous peoples have been racialized in a profoundly different way. Native Americanness is subtractive. Native Americans are constructed to become fewer in number and less native, but never exactly white over time. Our/their status as indigenous people/first inhabitants is the basis of our/their land claims, and the goal of settler colonialism is to diminish claims to land over generations, or sooner if possible. That is, Native American is a racialization that portrays contemporary indigenous generations to be less authentic, less indigenous than every prior generation, in order to ultimately phase out indigenous claims to land and usher in settler claims to property. This is primarily done through blood quantum registries and policies, which were forced on indigenous nations and communities and, in some cases, have overshadowed former ways of determining tribal membership. Wolf explains, quote, for Indians, in stark contrast, non-Indian ancestry compromised their indigeneity, producing quote-unquote half-breeds, a regime that persists in the form of blood quantum regulations. As opposed to enslaved people, whose reproduction augmented their owners' wealth, indigenous people obstructed settlers' access to land, so their increase was counterproductive. In this way, the restrictive racial classification of Indians straightforwardly furthered the logic of elimination, end quote. The racializations of indigenous people and black people in the U.S. settler colonial nation state are geared to ensure the ascendancy of white settlers as the true and rightful owners and occupiers of the land. Quote, in the national mythologies of such societies, it is believed that white people came first and that it is they who principally developed the land. Aboriginal peoples are presumed to be mostly dead or assimilated. European settlers thus become the original inhabitants and the group most entitled to the fruits of citizenship, end quote. Razak, 2002. In the racialization of whiteness, blood quantum rules are reversed so that white people can stay white, yet claim descendants from an Indian grandmother. In 1924, the Virginia legislature claimed passed the Racial Integrity Act, which enforced the one-drop rule except for white people who claimed a distant Indian grandmother. The result of strong lobbying from the aristocratic, quote-unquote, first families of Virginia, who all claimed to have descended from Pocahontas, including Nancy Reagan, born in 1921. Known as the Pocahontas exception, this loophole allowed thousands of white people to claim Indian ancestry, while actual indigenous people were reclassified as quote-unquote colored and disappeared off the public record. Settler nativism, through the claiming of a long-lost ancestor, invest in these specific racializations of indigenous people and black people, and disbelieves the sovereign authority of indigenous nations to determine tribal membership. Dakota scholar Kim Tauber, in an interview on the recent Elizabeth Warren example, provides an account that echoes and updates Deloria's account, speaking to the many versions of settler nativism she has encountered, in which people say, quote, "My great-great-grandmother was an Indian princess," or "I'm descended from Pocahontas." What Elizabeth Warren said about the high cheekbones, I've had so many people from across the political spectrum say things that strange or stranger. And my point is, maybe you do have some remote ancestor. So what? You don't just get to decide you're Cherokee if the community does not recognize you as such. End quote. Ancestry is different from tribal membership. Indigenous identity and tribal membership are questions that Indigenous communities alone have the right to struggle over and define, not DNA tests, heritage websites, and certainly not the settler state. Settler nativism is about imagining an Indian past and a settler future. In contrast, tribal sovereignty has provided for an Indigenous present, and various Indigenous intellectuals theorize decolonization as native futures without a settler state.